The TS-133 is QNAP's cheapest NAS at $139. Is it good value, or are they making too many sacrifices to hit such an incredible price point? Are you better off paying a bit more to get more features in your NAS? In this video, I review the TS-133 to see what you get for your money. At this price, you have to bring your own disk, but if you buy it from the Amazon store, you can opt to buy it with a 4 or 8 terabyte hard disk from either Seagate or Western Digital. I bought mine diskless so that I could try it out using both the hard disk that I already owned, and I bought a Crucial MX500 4 terabyte SSD to test that as well. In the box, you get the unit, a 36-watt power brick, a bag of screws for securing the drives inside, a warranty pamphlet, a card trying to sell you QNAP's extended warranty, and a quick installation guide. Now, this is completely subjective, but I think the unit's really good looking. It's not the kind of NAS you have to hide away because it's ugly or huge, or it takes up a lot of space. This is something that I'm fine to have on my desk alongside the rest of my gear. So you only get a single built-in SATA drive bay that fits either 3.5 or 2.5 inch drives. Installing a drive is easy. You just undo this single screw on the bottom and the case slides up and forward. Then you slide your drive into the SATA slot and secure it with 2 or 4 screws depending on whether it's a 2.5 or 3.5 inch drive. You put the case back on and you're good to go. The NAS is powered by a 4-core, 1.8 GHz ARM Cortex A55 processor and has a mere 2 GB of RAM, which is not upgradable. That's not a lot of computing power or RAM, but surprisingly, you can do a huge number of things with it, just not all at the same time. I tested the NAS with both a hard disk and then an SSD, and I was easily able to saturate the built-in 1 gigabit network interface, both reading and writing, with both the hard disk and the SSD, with my test showing 120 megabytes per second read and just slightly lower than that at 150 megabytes per second write. On the back of the NAS, you can see the power socket, the 1 gigabit Ethernet interface, and 2 USB-A ports, one being USB 2 at 500 megabits and the other one being USB 3 at 5 gigabits. And those 2 USB ports are probably the best thing about the NAS, especially that USB 3 port. You can plug in a thumb drive and share it as easily as you can share the internal hard disk. And according to QNAP's website, it even theoretically works with this QNAP 12-bay rack enclosure, making it capable of serving up a massive amount of storage. You can plug in a USB camera, and using the QNAP software downloadable from the App Center, you can record the output of 2 cameras for free. And if you need more than 2 cameras, there's a $2 a month charge for each additional camera you add after the first 2. The software does everything you'd expect it to, like only record if there's motion, and you can view your live footage or review your stored footage from an app on your computer or your phone. But it also works with network-attached cameras too. I bought this TP-Link VIGI C440i to test with, and I had no trouble connecting to it or recording the footage. The fact that all of your footage is privately kept off the cloud, you can keep it for as long as you want and have space for. The quality that you can record at is much higher than most cloud services, and that there's no ongoing cost if you only have 2 cameras makes this a good choice if you're interested in those features. But the single best use of the USB 3 port that I found was by plugging in a USB to 2.5 gigabit Ethernet adapter. I bought mine for $14 and it worked perfectly. As soon as you plug it in, the QNAP recognizes that the drive is there and it will start working with it. Both the 2.5 and 1 gigabit interfaces can work at the same time by having a different computer connect to each IP address on each NIC, giving you a total of 3.5 gigabits of network bandwidth. So I did some speed testing this way with both NICs running and an SSD on board. The combined write speed was 221 megabytes per second, and the combined read speed was 375 megabytes per second. This is where we're reaching the hard limits of the CPU. Write operations seem to be more intensive on the CPU than the read ones. And I can see in the write test that the CPU hits 100%. With just the 2.5 gigabit NIC connected, the results are 221 megabytes per second write and 275 megabytes per second read. And this is the permanent configuration that I went with just the 2.5 gigabit USB Ethernet adapter running, and I'm not using the 1 gigabit on board. Power usage is another amazing feature of the NAS. The heaviest power usage that I could get out of it was with 2 NICs connected and a physical spinning hard disk installed, writing at full speed. In this configuration, it used 14 watts under load and about 12 watts at idle. In my standard configuration with just the USB 2.5 gigabit Ethernet connected, not the internal NIC, and an SSD installed, it uses 3.6 watts idling and 5.5 watts under load. Now, you might want to save a tiny amount of power and just use the onboard Ethernet NIC. And again, if you're using an SSD, it used only 3.3 watts at idle and 5 watts under maximum load. These are insanely low figures. Leaving it running 24/7 in my standard configuration, where the idle is 3.6 watts, it'll use just 35 kilowatt hours a year. So if you take the US national average of 23 cents a kilowatt hour for the residential electricity rate, it only uses $7.24 a year to run it. Now, you will use more in a hard disk configuration, about 3 times as much, but $21 a year isn't a huge price to pay, even relative to the low cost of the unit itself. All QNAP NASs come with QNAP's management software, and there's 2 varieties, a professional one called QUTS Hero, and a more consumer-oriented one called QTS. The TS-133 comes with QTS. The sheer number of features is too many to list, but here are just some of the things that you might be interested in running. A web server, a syslog server, a radius server, a TFTP server, an FTP server. There's also an app store. The number of available apps is reduced on the TS-133, and that's because it has an ARM CPU. If it were to have an Intel CPU, it would have a lot more choice, but still, there's a lot of apps to explore, like backup software, a Plex media server, a web proxy server, a firewall, and a Docker environment, giving you even more choice of what you can do with the machine. Be warned that because of the small amount of RAM and limited CPU performance, you can only push the TS-133 so far, but you will be able to try out all of these functions and run a few that you find useful at the same time before performance becomes an issue. And that's probably what this product's all about. It's a super cheap way of getting a fully functional NAS with a large number of possible configurations, and it's an excellent self-education tool and a low-risk way to learn about the QNAP ecosystem. The obvious competitor in the market is the Synology DS124 at almost exactly the same price and feature set. I personally prefer the QNAP because you can't just plug and play a 2.5 gigabit adapter on the Synology, so by default it's 1 gigabit. I also prefer QNAP's software interface, with one exception, which is Synology's surveillance software, which I think is a bit easier to use. So if you're setting up a video surveillance station, then I'd recommend you go with the Synology. If you're interested in any of the products I've mentioned in the video, I'll put affiliate links in the description for them. Please use them so I can get a small commission if you buy. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you on the next one.